Good afternoon, everybody. It is my pleasure and privilege to welcome you all to the 15th edition of Taxonomy Bootcamp. My name is Stephanie Lemieux, President and Consultant at Dovecot Studio, and I'm honored to be serving as chair of this conference for a sixth time. Many of us bootcamp vets look forward to getting to see our taxonomy peeps once a year to share laughs, learn new things, and have some free drinks at the exhibit hall together. We also look forward to meeting the new crop of taxonomy enthusiasts and teaching them the secret handshake and blowing their minds with tales of marvelous metadata. You might say this conference is like the Burning Man of taxonomy. It's a little different this year. 2020 has thrown us a few curveballs. We won't get to physically rub elbows this year or build a giant ziggurat in the streets of DC. But if Burning Man can go virtual, so can we. I'm still thankful for the opportunity to at least get to see you all virtually. And if you're into it, we can build a giant knowledge graph together. Although 2020 has been tough for many of us, the one thing it has brought to the forefront is the importance of digital worlds. The job of a taxonomist is to improve the digital experience by making information and knowledge easier to find, more intelligent, and more connected. And in a world where we spend most of our days interacting with information systems, the value of our work has jumped to the forefront. The organization I'm working with right now is in the middle of at least 5 big digital transformation projects for knowledge management tools, all of them leaning pretty heavily on taxonomies and metadata. And we're also starting to experiment with ontologies and knowledge graphs. So even in a time of crisis, especially in a time of crisis where a big chunk of our lives have moved even more online, and the chaos that entails, knowledge organization and processing plays a key role, and we have to be ready to ride that wave. So in this new context, our keynote speaker is the right person to help us think about this strange new world of messiness and chaos. And I'm very excited to invite David Weinberger to the bootcamp. His first 3 books came out during my university career and very much influenced my approach to knowledge organization. So if you haven't read his 2007 book, Everything is Miscellaneous, which this talk will revisit, I highly recommend it. It will free you of the belief that there is a single right way to organize anything. David is closely affiliated with the Harvard Berkman Klein Center and just finished 2 years as a writer in residence embedded at a Google AI research group. And he was also co-director of the Harvard Library Innovation Lab. David, take it away.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I am thrilled and surprised to find the comparison of the boot camp is to Burning Man, because the boot camp appellation made me assume that you all come out of it sort of rock hard and swearing like sailors. And I am in fact going to, I gotta share my screen. And then I have to get the presentation, the endless presentation up. Almost there. Okay, so if you are not seeing and hearing the presentation, somebody should let me know because I'm doing it wrong. Okay, I'll assume. Good. Okay. Okay, so yes, I was asked to go back to a 2007 book, Everything is Miscellaneous, and that's what I haven't. I am going back to it. So 2007. This is the nice cover of the book. And the initial point, the book notices is totally obvious, which is that in the physical world, everything has to have a place, and it can only be in one place at a time. This is the limitation of the physical world. And as you know all about this when you're organizing your books, let's say, you got to pick one way of organizing. If it's alphabetical by author, it cannot simultaneously be by topic. This is the most basic thing. We have so all that's 100% obvious. What the book is about is the fact, maybe, that we seem in Western culture to have taken this physical limitation. Everything has to be in a place and only one place at a time, and imported it as if it were a feature and not a bug, imported it into how we think about meaning, as if things only have one real meaning. Nah, that's what happens when you are organizing physical stuff, not ideas and things like ideas. So the bars just came down because you're about to see a bit of a 2007 presentation, different aspect ratio, different font. And so this is just pieces of talk that I gave back then by way of context. So one of the ways of starting this is to look at, say, Plato, who pointed out or claimed, as if it were obvious, that a philosopher or natural scientist, a term that didn't exist at the time, who wants to know what things are, wants to understand things, that person needs to carve nature at its joints, the way you would carve a turkey at its joints and not try to saw through the bone. But the implication, of course, is that nature has identifiable joints. There's a right and wrong way to carve up the world. And Aristotle, who was Plato's student, took this further and said, and here's what the joints look like. The human job is to know what things are, and Plato agrees with that, and much of Western culture has agreed with this throughout our history. We are the creatures that who know things, and to know what a thing is to know its essence. And, says Aristotle, its essence, its definition, is what group is the thing in and how is it different from that group? So a group might be something like birds. So a robin here is, first thing you need to know about its essence is that it's a bird. The second thing you need to know is how it is different from all the other birds. It has a red breast. And those sorts of definitions are exclusive. They pick out and define a single thing, define it uniquely, and that's what the thing is. And we have, I know this sounds weird now, but in the West, we held on to this until about 150 years ago. This was how we proceeded in trying to know the world, identify the essence of each thing. So in everything is miscellaneous, I suggest that we're adding a new type of order. And the first and traditional type of order is the one in which you organize the things themselves, the books on the shelves. In the second order, which is also clearly quite ancient, you separate the metadata about the things from the things and you organize them. But in so doing, you tend to reduce the information in the thing, in this case, a book, down to what fits on a literal tag or label or index card. Insanely useful, of course. I'm not arguing against any of this, but also really, really limited. Now but we've gotten extremely good at doing it. Now we have a third order. It's new in the world. In the third order, both the data, like the books and content, is electronic, is digital data, and the metadata is as well. Everything becomes digital. And this changes things really, really, really profoundly in terms of how we organize things and what we think things are. These full blue bars are not from the original presentation, but I'm trying to get through this quickly. So, so here are some of the things that the book says change. The first is that data and metadata both become really fluid. It used to be there was a clear distinction. The data were the books on the shelf and the metadata were the cards about the books in the card catalog, and all the other sorts of examples as well. But now there's really no difference between data and metadata, except that data is the thing you're looking for, and metadata is the thing that you know that will help you find what you're looking for. And that depends upon what you know and how somebody chooses to organize it. So Call Me Ishmael is part of the content of Moby Dick, its first line, of course. And so that counts as data for sure. But if your question is, what is that book that starts with the line, Call Me Ishmael? That becomes metadata by which you find the book. There is no, the only difference between data and metadata is functional. It's not a real or a hard, it's a real difference. It's not a hard difference. That is world changing, that fact that happened. The second is, of course, there's no limit on how much metadata you want to use, since the entire book can be metadata for the book. There's no limit on it. No, in practical terms, there's no limit on it. It also means the source of the metadata in the digital world, especially the connected world, connected digital world, Doesn't have to be the old authorities, which means that authorities lose some control. You lose control of the metadata, you lose control of a lot. And this, back in the early 2000s, this was a source of a great deal of concern. It still is. It's a little less panicky now. We've accepted that it's happened. But there was some degree of, panic that bad data would be circulating. I recognize this is a real problem, but there was a serious, in part, I think, because it was a challenge to authority, not just to the efficiency of metadata. And we get an explosion of meaning. The book now, I think, somewhat weirdly focused on tagging as a key example. Tagging was relatively new on the digital world. It was quite new. And the standard example, which the book leaned on heavily, was a site that went out of business a couple of years later. Publishing, it's locked into print now, was Delicious, which was a great site. And I'm still sorry it went away. At Delicious, as some of you will remember, anybody could post the links that they were tracking, they wanted to keep track of, and tag them. And that was new. What a radical idea. You could apply as many tags as you wanted. And even more mind-blowing is that you could then not only find all of the links that you've tagged with design, but anybody could find all of the links anybody has tagged with design or combinations of other tags. And it's a crazy valuable resource. It would be amazing for building knowledge graphs now, but it went away. Nevertheless, tagging is still with us. It's still at Flickr. Flickr is still with us. It's a Stack Overflow, an insanely popular and useful question and answer site for software developers and more, actually. Amazon uses automatically generated tags for reviews. Steam, which is the game aggregator, uses them extensively and has a quite extensive user interface for individuals to manipulate them, which is very useful. Tons of other examples, including the Finder, Apple Finder. But maybe the most influential use of tags these days is our hashtags at Twitter, where they not only enable people to find tags on related topics, but they also allow things to trend, which gives them some political or cultural import. And tags, as is always the case, once they leave the hands of dedicated people charged with organizing information, such as you, tend to take on a wide variety of roles, including commentary, sometimes semi-ironic commentary on the content itself, as with the sorry, not sorry tag. So tagging is still with us. So I'm not going to apologize, well, except I will, for focusing on tagging so much in the book. I think it's still a good example of allowing multiple meanings that are personal and yet shared, and allow for some type of algorithmic collection and analysis of them. But the book talked about more than tagging, of course. One of the other things that pointed out, again, something that was already happening and it was really important to the internet and still is that the old way of organizing a collection was to filter the content on the way in, right? You figure out how much room you have in your library and which books should be in it, or any other example of organizing physical objects. Because of the nature of physical objects, you have to limit what's coming in. And so we got very good at filtering into collections, curating collections, which is no small art and skill. And science. But with the web, we saw a new approach blossoming, and is still, I think is the predominant approach, which is, in general, we do not filter on the way in. We assume that we want as much as we want to make available as much as we possibly can, because we cannot anticipate what our users are going to want. Something that seems trivial to us may turn out to be crucial for them. So what the heck, include it. So we don't filter on the way in. Instead, usually we provide tools for filtering on the way out. So the user can find what she wants in very increasingly sophisticated ways. And we've gotten very used to this model, but it's radically new. It was radically new. It changes many, many things, and the book talks about them as well. For one thing, we get a superabundance of content, of course, but we also get a superabundance of meaning, which I will be talking about in a minute. So I am actually going to read the text on a slide to you. I don't like doing this, but I will. So I think this is a quote from the book. I no longer quite remember. We are constructing this infrastructure with every tag, every blog post, every playlist, every semantic web triple, every hyperlink. Every hyperlink is a joint, and I was here thinking of Plato's joints. I mean, sorry, the joints that Plato was talking about, not actually Plato's arthritic elbow. Every hyperlink is a joint, but it's a joint where we join, not where we cut. That is a lot of what the book is about when it comes to meaning. So the sidebars go up and we're back away from that, that presentation with its horrible font, which is in fact my handwriting turned into a font. I used that for many years and I apologize to people who saw previous presentations. Okay, so now I think we are, I will stand by everything I just said. I think that stuff is basically right. And I don't think it's news to you at all. If it is, you'll let me know, especially if it's fake news, wrong news. So look, that was looking back. Looking forward, I think we have moved from and are continuing to move from the miscellaneous to sense making. So I want to start with a couple of questions, with 3 questions actually. And the first is, well, how are we making sense? And the answer to that is we're doing it together. Obviously, I'm going to say more about this. And the second question is, how are we making sense? And the answer is, well, basically, we are making sense through networks, not just social networks of people connected, but of people being connected, but of ideas being connected. And we assume that the architect, I think in general these days, we assume that the architecture of these networks mirror the architecture we've gotten used to on the internet. That they tend to be global. It tends to be everybody can connect to everybody else. They tend to be dense and complex and not to have any identifiable starting or end points. Those are characteristics of the internet type of network. They are by no means characteristic of all networks. The fact that this is now generally how we think about networks as part of the deep influence that our life on the internet for the past 25 years has had on us. So we are making sense by putting things into these sorts of networks. I was so happy to hear talk of knowledge graphs, which I think are tremendously important, and which have something like that shape. So the third question, we may notice is the same question, is how are we making sense? And the answer to this question I want to spend some time with is, what are the tools and techniques and processes that we're using to make sense of things? And one is, I think clearly the hyperlink. I know the web is old news, that it no longer has the prominence that it once did, but that prominence is in some ways the prominence of the persistent background, the context that we assume. There are heading towards 2 billion websites. The number of hyperlinks is higher than that, significantly higher than that. That took a lot of work by a lot of people, a worldwide effort that resulted in this largest collection of content and web of links ever. And that's one of the ways that we put things together. Those links are both content-based, but also can express attitudes and you know, a link obviously can express anything from this is the source of my content to I really disagree. Here's a really opposing idea. There's no set semantic meaning to links. And so an incredibly rich world, connected public world. So we also make sense through social media, picked out 3 here, but that also means that social media are tearing sense apart, because now for the first time, we can see how the world thinks, and what we took for granted and seems obvious turns out not to be obvious and is not taken for granted by others. We are making sense through architectures and tools like the semantic web and other forms of semantic tech, which help make pieces reusable and more understandable both to machines and ultimately to humans as well. And that is a type of sense making. It just is, and it's incredibly important. We're making sense through things like linked open data and knowledge graphs and machine learning models, all of which are incredibly important and will only become more important as time goes on. And we're doing it through learning in public. We used to think of education along a school model in which it's basically a one-to-one relationship with the teacher. Yeah, it's in a class, but you are learning from the teacher. You are the beneficiary of the learning. And now, far more often than we ever did before, we are insisting on learning in public. Stack Overflow, which I had mentioned earlier, is a site where developers ask one another questions and get extensive answers to often highly specific sorts of questions. All of that is, if I post a question and get an answer, that answer is available to everybody in the world, everybody on the web, literally. I could have gotten an answer perhaps that would have informed me, but why should I be the only one who's been taught this? And so there's been an ethos of public learning, and that is a way in which we make sense together. And I think it's one of the most important things the web has brought us. And then more pieces of this infrastructure: open source, open access, open licenses, open APIs, and then underneath them all, making things more interoperable. That is so that ideas and services and software and so forth that have been created for one application can be reused, often without permission or compensation, through open licenses in other systems, put to new purposes. And that is so enriching for culture and for the world culture. So I think that it's not unfair. I think it is fair to say that we are now have achieved peak collaborative sense making. We may take it even further, but in human history, we are doing more sense making and doing it together than at any other time in human history, both because we have the tools and because the tools require us to see that we need to be making sense together. There's so much stuff that we need to contextualize and understand, and just seeing that there's so much stuff and so many different opinions and different facts, so to speak, claims of facts, requires us to engage in this collaborative sense making, and we are doing it. So then you could ask, okay, then why does everything suck so bad? And that's a fair question. I would say, just sort of in parentheses, it's not really, it's terrible. It is absolutely terrible. People are victimized, bullied, hurt, lied to, and worse, far worse. All that's true, and I don't mean to make light of it, nor would I. There is this other piece of it, though, which is, actually it works pretty well, at least for most of us. Even if, God forbid, you are one of the victims of the internet shop of horrors, an involuntary customer there, nevertheless, you are very likely using the internet to make sense of things. It's your source of information. It's where you talk with others who are your friends, or at least not trolling asshats. And together you do what all of us do, which is to raise a point, ask a question, discuss, push back. You still use the internet for making sense. And I understand that that's way below the surface of concern when you are in fact the victim of internet stalking or any of the other nightmares. The digitizing of content and metadata has unstuck meaning, right? It's remove the authorities and there's overabundance of it, but and the net has revealed, in fact, that we disagree more and more. And this is an impetus to us. This is why we are engaging in so much collaborative sense making. It's also the source of challenges to that sense making. And so I want to talk about a few of those challenges. And the first is, I'm doing more reading of slides than I generally do, but that's what happens when you use 600-point fonts, I guess. We are really good at disbelieving things. The internet has made us better at it than ever, as well as falling for a lot of fake news and that sort of stuff. I hate even saying the name fake news. Sorry, my anxiety had dropped for, a little bit over the past week or two, and I just popped it right back up. Chase away those bad thoughts. Okay, so the internet has made us good at disbelieving, but we haven't really gotten nearly good enough at learning how to come to belief. So there is a lot of interest and emphasis on critical thinking, which I totally support, but it's not enough. At least traditional critical thinking, which I used to teach for 5 years. Because critical thinking teaches us how to disbelieve, right? You spot the errors in the thought, and now you can disbelieve that thought. That is traditional critical thinking. It has been changing usefully over time. But we also need to learn how to come to belief, which is a different skill. And so in the old days, before the internet, teaching critical thinking was considered to be essential and enough because because we assumed that we had a steady stream of reliable information because that was how the media worked. We had 3 stations, we had on TV, 3 networks on TV, and they were giving us a very homogenized, white man view of what counts and why it counts. And so that was there. And so all you had to do was find the places where there was a mistake or a lie or engage in your critical thinking, and then you would purify that stream. But we no longer have that stream, at least not one that we trust, and to give us all the answers. And I've given the nature, the white and male and set of authorities who are taking care of this stream, and generally pretty well, but nevertheless, overly influenced by unknowingly by their own privilege. I think we all agree, we're glad we don't have only those 3 channels anymore. So this makes the need to make sense together all the more important. And echo chambers are a challenge to that, but I actually want to push back against that idea. I don't think they are the main problem. They are an issue, but I don't think they're the main problem. And I will tell you why. An echo chamber is a conversation space. And the way that humans converse is to start with this gigantic basis of agreement and then iterate on tiny differences. So when you run into somebody in the hallway of the conference later on today who you don't know, when you start up a conversation, you'll engage in this delicate dance of small talk, in which you try to find something that you agree about enough that you can have a conversation that then may blossom out. So it's unlikely, you never know, right? But it's unlikely that you're going to go up to somebody and express your views about President Trump either way. And I think probably if you're a supporter, you're unlikely to, it's a bad conversational move. It's probably not going to lead to a great conversation. And if that's not a good example, I take it back. That's why we end up talking about the weather and movies and things like that in small talk, because we have found so somebody starts to talk to me about sports, I'll say, I'm not a big sports guy, and then we'll find a different topic. We'll talk about movies. Conversation iterates on small differences. We have to have that basis of agreement because we have to be speaking a common language. Start with that. We need to agree on what's worth talking about and interesting to talk about. And that's already reducing differences quite substantially. But we also have to agree about the norms of conversation. Who gets to speak and for how long and how much? Can you make a joke or will that seem disrespectful? Can you interrupt or will that seem disrespectful? And the like. There's so many norms and it's so easy to go wrong, but we inhabit them so deeply that generally we don't, except when we have conversations with strangers who may come from different cultures or different parts of our own culture, that is on the internet. Conversation iterates on small differences. And if that's not happening, you're probably not having a good conversation. It's by iterating on these small differences that we come to belief. In the traditional model, you have a Nazi and a Jew. I'll say I'm on one side of that debate. I'm a Jew, and we're supposed to talk about our differences, and this is the perfect conversation. Those conversations never, ever really happen. The way people come to belief is talking and iterating on small differences. And that's what we want, I think, generally. In any case, that's what we're stuck with. So, we can say that climate scientists are an echo chamber because they don't spend a lot of time in their conversational spaces where they're talking about research and literature and the like. They're not spending a lot of time talking with climate change deniers. But that's good because the way that science and all forms of culture work is through conversations that have the form of an echo chamber. People who share so much in common in their belief structure and in their norms, advancing their science or their art by iterating on small differences. Right? If every time a climate scientist wanted to talk to another one, but first they had to argue about whether climate change, the human role in climate change is significant or not, they would never get to what we want climate scientists to be talking about. So that's an echo chamber in its form, but good. This is how art and culture advance. If there are a set of climate change deniers, that's an echo chamber too. They have the same form. They're talking to themselves and they're iterating on small differences. The problem is not that they are echo chambers, these two. The problem is that one of them is wrong. The climate deniers are wrong. And if you disagree, you can just switch it for purpose of the speech, but nevertheless, climate deniers are wrong. It's not that it's an echo chamber, it's that what they are echoing is mistaken, erroneous, unrelated to reality. It's not echo chambers. Now, echo chambers can be problems. Right? I'm putting this too strongly, but our problem is not that we have echo chambers. It's that there are people who are convinced that they are right when they are wrong and do not have the tools, capability, or perhaps the interest in moving away from their beliefs. Those are educational problems. They're not problems of echo chambers or conversation themselves. However, so now I'm on record as saying echo chambers are great, and I want to be careful because that's not entirely true. So there is a difference between contradiction and difference. There's a difference between a climate change scientist who is arguing with a denier, in which there's just a contradiction, and climate change scientists who are having a conversation that excludes different points of view that are embedded in, that arise from different experiences, different ways in which people are treated in society, and the like. And that's a dangerous thing. The problem is that unless we take care, only loud voices are heard, but loud is a nice way of saying powerful. Ultimately, these are questions of power. Now, in my writing and career, I don't pay nearly enough attention to power. I think that's a consequence of my relative privilege with the middle class upbringing and being a at least relatively privileged white guy. So it bothers me that I have not paid enough attention to it, but I recognize that it is in fact the case that many of these questions come down to questions of power. So we could say that if we want to increase the miscellaneousness of the world, which is to say to recognize its infinite number of facets and meanings and shades, because that's the truth, then we need to open our hearts, which is true, but it's not just that. It also means we need to do this by those of us who have some degree of power by way of privilege, if nothing else, need to consciously try to relinquish that power. That's hard to do for all sorts of reasons, including the fact that it's, having power is good. In some sense, it's good, you know what I mean. So this is where I'm going to end. We can look at the history of the internet as increasing miscellaneousness. We can applaud it as I do, for liberating us from unnecessarily restrictive ideas about what the world is. It's not speaking in a single voice. Things don't have single meanings. We have diminished our acceptance of the limitations of the physical when applied to ideas has limited our ability to deal with ideas. It's also had really practical and devastating effects on populations that are more vulnerable. So we can see those positive and negative effects of the internet on the miscellaneous and the miscellaneous on our lives and culture and world. I don't know how to resolve these issues. And a big part of me thinks that this is a generational issue. It's going to take one or more generations for us to really be able to embrace the miscellaneous without reinstituting institutions of power. Like many 70-year-old white men, I am given hoped by and inspired by the younger generations. I think it's going to be a long struggle. And if you, like I think many of us here are, inspired by the past years of struggle and rising outrage and rising organization and collaboration, then I think this is one of the places where we should perhaps give the internet a little bit of credit while recognizing all the ways in which it's horrible. So we may be moving towards a more miscellaneous world. I hope that we are. Will be a world that's more complex. And as this generation, and not just this generation, of course, but as the younger generation is accepting more complexity, they are less binary, they are more fluid in their beliefs and behaviors and attitudes, they are more intersectional, and they're more miscellaneous. We should be cheered by this generational change while at the same time doing everything we can to advance it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. That was great. So if you just want to unshare your screen, that'll just bring up our picture. So I have a couple of questions in the chat, but first I wanted to ask you, taking all of these viewpoints about how to be more intersectional in your thinking, more fluid, more miscellaneous, how should we as taxonomists who are building concrete sense making into things like a graph, which underpin systems and are kind of, forcing is a strong word, but putting out a specific way of thinking about connections and knowledge, what should we take from what you're saying and embed into our practice as we kind of are exerting power by building models?
So I don't have a great answer to this, and I wish I did, or I wish somebody did that I knew of, and probably someone does. So I think the sort of standard answer and the comforting answer that I personally fall back on way too much is, well, you need to reach out to, you have to include more difference in who you are building for, which means talking with and researching how other people in different situations, what cultures that your work may be reaching, think about how to organize the world. What are the terms they use, how they see them connected, what are assumptions that you are making that are prejudicial unknowingly and inevitably. And so you need to enlarge the conversation. So I think all that's true, except that I'm waving my hands about enlarging the conversation, and I don't know how to do that. I mean, I can say some platitudinous things, but as far as, and you would know, you, the audience, would know better than I do, the extent to which processes have been sort of sustainable and repeatable processes have been developed for reaching out into communities that one normally wouldn't reach. Short of that, and that's wonderful insofar as it's happening. If it is, you know more about it than I do. If it's not happening enough, then the less comfortable answer is assume you're going to do the best you can. That's the first assumption. The second is it's not going to be good enough. Whatever it is that your taxonomy is going to come under critique because you can't possibly anticipate every way in which you can go wrong or every omission that you've made. We were all situated in a culture that ultimately is the context in which things make sense to us, and we can't jump over our own shadow. We can't jump out of that culture and suddenly inhabit another. We depend upon those other cultures, subcultures, et cetera, letting us know. And if there isn't a systematic way to do that before the taxonomy is created, then you have to expect that you're going to get pushback. And somebody's going to say, that term is really very offensive in my culture, or you're dividing things that shouldn't be divided, or you didn't divide things that should be divided, et cetera, because you can't get it right. So and psychologically, that means being prepared for people to be genuinely outraged. And it means being prepared to accept that and as part of being human, say, Thank you. Thank you. I mean, genuinely, I find this very hard. I'm a human being. I find it hard to do this, but I think it's really important to be able to do it. I wish I were better at it, but I now understand something that I didn't. Thank you. And we will make adjustments. In terms of structure, it means building structures that can be adjusted. There's one other source of hope for this, because I don't know how this works out, right? Because we both want, we want to make sense, but we also want to maintain separate senses. We want different groups, different people, different cultures to have different senses of the world, but we don't want them so isolated that they become genuine echo chambers and we can't ever converse. And so on a technical ground, technology ground, building sort of interoperable data structures, ones that are able to connect with other data structures through sort of translations of common terms and the like, which is a pretty well-known challenge. I think it's hugely, hugely important. It's how you knit the world back together. Let the systems learn from each other. I'll leave it there. It's a great question, really difficult problem. And I hope you all know more about it than I do.
Excellent. We have actually the same question formulated a couple of different ways, centered around the idea of misinformation, which I think has been very apropos the last few months or years maybe. So the question is here, how do we manage communications or dialogue with people who are either holding an opposing opinion or actively promoting misinformation?
So this is really important questions to which I have non-important answers. Those are two different cases, right? So one is where you are talking, let's just imagine for a moment, just as a hypothetical, that I were not a Trump supporter and I want to have a conversation with somebody who is, and it's somebody, let's say, who matters to me. I think one of the tricks, let me go back a step. So in the Enlightenment rational philosophy that we've all grown up in one way or another, as I mentioned, the idea is that two people who strongly oppose each other can have a decent conversation in which they work through their premises all the way down and they agree. The Jew says to the Nazi, look, I mean, I disagree with you, but let's talk. And if it turns out you're right, I will gladly become a Nazi. And the Nazi says, thank you, my Jewish friend. Likewise, I will become a Jew. That never, ever, ever happens. It never happens. It's an insane fiction that has guided a lot of our pedagogy and our ideas about political discourse. What does happen, though, is that two people who disagree fundamentally can say, look, I know I'm not going to convince you, but I'm actually interested in, because it seems crazy to me what you believe. I believe you believe it sincerely. I'm not going to try to convince you, and you shouldn't expect you can convince me, because you're not. I'm not going to become a Nazi. I'm not going to become a Trump supporter, to tell you the truth. Let's have a conversation about that without any attempt to convert each other. And once you take that pressure off, then you can have a conversation. It can be hard just to take that pressure off, especially as the person is saying things more and more outrageous you want to disagree with. The question of misinformation is, to a large degree, obviously a social, institutional, technological, it's not a matter of how can you convince a Trump supporter that Trump actually lost the election. I mean, that's a different issue. The question is, when authorities are saying false things or ideas are being spread by groups that are gaining a lot of traction at a social level, how can you manage them? How the hell would I know? I don't know. I mean, you try to do what you can through the social platforms, but I don't have a, I don't know how you do that.
Are you telling me you can't fix society?
Oh, no, I can do that. But it's going to cost you. That's what I'm trying to say. A huge consulting fee for fixing all of society.
Indeed. Excellent. Well, thank you very much. I'll applaud for all the folks in the virtual space who cannot physically applaud. But I invite you all, there is a networking space, so you can go to the networking icon over on the side if you'd like to continue the conversation on this topic. And then our next taxonomy bootcamp session, which is on taxonomy governance, starts at 2 p.m. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you. Have a wonderful conference.